I love the X-Men villains, and when Marvel reboots the X-Men, one of those X-foes is going to need to be the first one, pun intended, but which X-villain makes the most sense? Let's figure it out. Also, the pun, and I don't know if this qualifies as a pun, is that the first one is the English translation of Apocalypse's real name, and Sabanur. Hi, I'm Nando, and I V movies. And since 2026 is the year of the X-Men, I also X movies. So I want to answer this question. Which X-Men villain makes the most sense as the main antagonist in the eventual MCU X-Men movie? Now obviously we're working under a lot of assumptions here, like that this won't just be an origin story, kind of like X-Men First Class, but something closer to X1 where we meet an X-Men team that has existed for a while, sort of like Fantastic Four First Steps or Spider-Man Homecoming. That just seems to be how Marvel likes to play these. We know the movie will be directed by Thunderbolts director Jake Schreier and written by the Hunger Games Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes writer Michael Leslie. We don't know which X-Men will be on the team, although rumors point to a similar squad to the one we met in X-Men 97 Season 1, albeit maybe with some substitutions, and that's about all we know. It's gonna come after Secret Wars, which very well could reboot the universe, so pretty much any story is on the table. Then what are we looking for? I'm very open here, but I do have a couple of criteria that I want to use to narrow our list down. Mid-tier. I shouldn't need to say this, but I'm gonna. Don't make the team's first bad guy one of the really big deals. And not because a fresh team couldn't conceivably beat one, but if they did, where do they go next? Everything feels like a downgrade. There's a reason it took a while for the Avengers to fight Thanos. Number 2, should be connected to an X-Men. So we don't know which X-Men are going to make up the actual team, but let's say it's who you'd expect, maybe with a couple swaps. There are plenty of X-villains who have personal connections to specific X-Men. Some are related, some are clones, and some just know each other well. But either way, there are plenty of X-villains with connections to specific X-Men, but ones that I would not expect to see in this movie, so those villains should probably be saved for later. And number 3, fresh. This is the one that really hits home for me. You need to take into account what people have already seen. Does this mean we never put Magneto in one of these? Of course not, but we've got a large pool to choose from, and some characters have either had their shot and missed, which tends to leave a bad taste in audiences' mouths, or they've had their shot and hit big, meaning every subsequent actor in that role is going to need to measure against them. And if you are taking another shot at a character we've seen before, you better justify why. Like, yeah, Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer did the Cloud Galactus, but then Fantastic Four First Steps did the Guy Galactus. Doesn't necessarily need to be more faithful, but it just needs to be different. People are not buying a ticket to a movie they've already seen, and especially one they've already seen and didn't really like. Real quick up top, I wanted to find some terms I'm going to use that not everyone is familiar with. When I say core X-Men book or movie, I mean a story about the X-Men, the team of mutants usually headquartered at the Xavier Institute for Gifted Youngsters and made up of the most senior team members. There are plenty of other smaller groups like the New Mutants who eventually changed their name to X-Force, and then there's a different X-Force, an X-Factor, an X-Terminators, Academy X. Those are what I would call X-Teams from X-Books. Stories with mutants doing anything but being the core X-Men. And sometimes it feels like there are multiple core X-Men groups. For instance, during the 80s, half of the X-Men were secretly living in the Australian outback, and half were fighting crime as the X-Factor team. Neither were officially the X-Men, and many of the core X-Men characters were part of X-Factor. But the outback team were the characters we followed in the Uncanny X-Men comic series, which makes them the core X-Men. I also talk about power signatures a bit here. Power signatures are the way a non-visual superpower like telepathy or telekinesis is represented on the page or screen. Different characters are associated with different shapes and colors. I mentioned Krakoa a few times. Krakoa is a living island that Xavier, Magneto, and a bunch of other mutants turned into a mutant utopia, which is different from Utopia, another island, this one made from an old space station, that the X-Men lived on for a bit. Genosha was a country that was originally ruled by a hostile government, but eventually used as a safe haven for mutants, and like every mutant safe haven, including Krakoa, it was eventually genocided. The Inhumans come up a few times. They're like mutants, except their deal is they don't get powers at birth or adolescence. Inhumans get their powers from exposure to a fictional mineral called Terrigen, and specifically a Terrigen mist. Terrigen exposure is the responsibility of the royal family and happens at the same point in every Inhuman's life, like a bar or bat mitzvah. The Inhumans mostly do their own thing and hide on the moon. So I have made a list of all of the X-villains you could conceivably set up as the antagonist in an X-Men movie. I have categorized them based on how likely I think they are to show up. That comes down to a lot of factors. What have movie audiences already seen? Who could you conceivably set up in one movie? And most importantly, who would it be interesting to see the X-Men face first? I have 3 categories here. I'm going to run through the first one real quick. These are X-Men villains who conceivably could be the big bad of a movie, but would make zero sense here. These are the uh-ohs. Strife, a clone of Cable who is raised by Apocalypse and goes back to the present day where he forms the Mutant Liberation Front and invents the Legacy virus. So we don't have an Apocalypse yet, we have not introduced Cable yet, and it is way too early for a Legacy virus plotline. Also, I don't really like Strife. Dark Phoenix, Jean Grey possessed by a cosmic force known as the Phoenix. She becomes mad with power, defeats the X-Men, and blows up a star system. Then she feels bad about it. I swear to God, if I see Dark Phoenix in the first mutant phase, I'm gonna destroy the X-Mansion myself. We did it twice in the movies. It was a dud both times. I believe this could work on film, but nothing, and I mean nothing, would immediately signal that Marvel has no idea what they're doing quicker than another watered-down Dark Phoenix saga. Selene, ageless goth energy vampire who tends to be part of the Hellfire Club, and is also one of a few immortal mutants known as Externals. She's able to do magic, and is most known for organizing the Necrotia attack, where she resurrected a bunch of dead mutants and sent them to attack the X-Men. She was technically in the Dark Phoenix movie, but not really, so why did I even bring it up? I actually like Selene, but it's too early. Necrotia only works if we see some X-Men die, but like in a couple of years when we've killed some main characters, Selene could be fun. Donald Pierce and the Reavers. Donald Pierce is another member of the mutant secret society known as the Hellfire Club, although, unlike all of his fellow members of the Inner Circle, Donald is not a mutant. He's a cyborg. You may sort of recognize him as that character played by Boyd Holbrook in Logan, although, like some of these other guys, they took a lot of liberties with his whole deal. In the movie Logan, he leads a group of villains known as the Reavers, which makes sense because in the comics, the Reavers are a bunch of henchmen who got their limbs cut off by Wolverine and then replaced with cyborg parts. Some of them are pretty generic, some of them, like Bonebreaker, are pretty iconic. They are most known for crucifying Wolverine. Like Selene, the Reavers are a product of the X-Men, and specifically Logan's past coming back for revenge, and I feel like we need to wait at least one movie before we get into that sort of story. As for Donald, and we'll get into it, I don't hate the Hellfire Club as an early antagonist, but I think having Donald on the board feels unnecessary, especially since he's the only high-profile non-mutant, so if they wanted to kick someone, it's him. Also, we can't crucify Wolverine again, because we just did that. Orcus. Orcus is a recent villain group, made up mostly of evil scientists who are worried that in the near future, the mutant population will explode and dwarf the human population. So Orcus tries to genocide the mutants. Notable members include Dr. Stasis, MODOK, Moira 10, Fei Long, Nimrod, and a bunch of members of AIM, Hydra, S.H.I.E.L.D., and every other Marvel organization. Too early for these guys too. They need to figure out what's going on with some of these teams that we're going to pull Orcus members from, and also, MODOK didn't really work. And also, the comics where Orcus does stuff aren't incredibly popular. John Sublime and the U-Men. Okay, John Sublime is an evil sentient bacteria who can control minds, but not mutant minds, so he hates them. He's kind of fun. His henchmen are the U-Men, a bunch of people who want to fight the X-Men, so they steal mutant powers by surgically attaching mutant body parts to their own body. They're also kind of fun. Too complicated for a first movie villain, but I do think teasing John Sublime isn't a bad idea. Apocalypse. The first mutant, if you don't count a bunch of others. En-Sabanur is an Egyptian mutant warlord who merged with celestial technology to become incredibly powerful. He is sort of the X-Men's Thanos, although nowhere near as strong. Apocalypse has the ability to fully control his own molecules so he can grow, heal, turn his arm into a gun, and do a bunch of other stuff too. Apocalypse is also a powerful telepath, and he can enhance mutant abilities which he uses to empower 4 of his field generals known as the Horsemen. Apocalypse believes in survival of the fittest and wants to push evolution forward by any means necessary. Listen, you cannot have a movie where you introduce the main X-Men and they also kill their Thanos. Here's proof. Apocalypse is the most obvious Phase 2 or Phase 3 big bad, and while I think establishing Apocalypse as a historical figure could be cool, we can't do anything with him this early. Next, we're going to look at the ones that would not surprise me, but would not make me think whoever's in charge of this thing has lost it. These are the Shores, and we'll start with 2, Proteus and/or Legion. Proteus and Legion are the X-Leadership's most powerful problem children. Both have extreme mutant abilities that usually render them unstable, forcing the X-Men to intervene. Proteus is the child of scientist friend and secret mutant, although that may have already been retconned, Moira McTaggart. His real name is Kevin. We recently learned that he didn't just turn out to be a mutant by chance. In an attempt to create a mutant team who could resurrect dead mutants, Professor X and Moira engineered the genetics to create a super baby, Weird. Moira spends much of her energy trying to keep Proteus at bay because of how destructive his mutant ability to warp reality can be. Marvel has a handful of reality warping mutants like Wanda, Jamie Braddock, Mad Jim Jaspers, Franklin Richards and Matthew Malloy, and almost all of their stories, at least their introductions, involve the reality warper losing control of their powers or just plain old losing their mind. Proteus is no exception. With great power comes great liability. Legion, or David Haller, is the child of Professor X and Gabriel Haller. Although, unlike Proteus, Legion was abandoned by his super parent, which created a fair amount of stress in their relationship and some abandonment issues for David, which were only compounded by the fact that Legion has mutant dissociative identity disorder, and every identity has its own superpower. So while he's not as reliably dangerous as Proteus, Legion can be a real problem. While Proteus has only been represented in the animated material, Legion obviously had a hit FX show that ran for 3 seasons. Many people would call it the best live-action superhero show ever made, and while I may not agree, I get it. It's stylish, provocative, human, and Dan Stevens played a hell of a Legion. Why not these two? Well, let's start with Proteus. I'm not an enormous fan of reality warpers. There's too much going on. Unless we're doing something very focused, like WandaVision being a blast through sitcoms past, just like weavy lines and trees melting doesn't interest me. Also, even though she played a big role in the second generation, and even had a cameo in the first, most audiences don't know who Moira McTaggart is. Down the line, sure, a Proteus story could be great, but like a lot of these guys, it's too early for him. I'd say sort of the same for Legion. Powers are vague, backstory connects to a character we're meeting for the first time, even though most people know who Professor X is. But the biggest knock against David is that we've already had an iconic live-action Legion. And sure, he wasn't in the movies, but Dan Stevens' Legion is the bar any new version would be measured against, and while you never know, it could work, feels risky. Exodus. Benet du Paris was a crusader in the 12th century who ran into Apocalypse. Apocalypse challenged Benet, and to save his own life, Benet's mutant ability activated and he became Exodus. He then turned on Apocalypse and was defeated and entombed until he was discovered by Magneto in the modern age. He was one of Magneto's acolytes, and after Magneto was rendered unable to lead the acolytes, Exodus took over. He led troops against the Avengers and the High Evolutionary, being pretty handily defeated each time, and in the Krakoan age, Exodus was given a seat on the Quiet Council alongside top-tier mutants like Magneto, Apocalypse, and Professor X. So what can Exodus do? He has psionic powers, which means he can use telekinesis, telepathy, and all kinds of mind-based stuff. He can manipulate your mood, heal, and drain your life force. But that first one, telekinesis, is where Exodus shines. He is the strongest telekinetic in existence, and he can use his telekinesis to augment his strength, durability, and even move atoms to rearrange matter. But the fun thing about Exodus, besides the look, which is great, is that his powers are amplified by belief. So if those around Exodus believe in his goals, that faith can empower Exodus. And that's a good thing because Exodus has a real savior complex. He believes that he should lead mutant kind, and specifically against so-called impurities. That means he wants to wipe out all of the mutates and artificial mutants. If you weren't born powerful, you gotta go. So that's him against the Avengers, Eternals, and especially the Inhumans. So why could Exodus be fun? Well, he's Magneto, but not Magneto. So if audiences want a movie without the Master of Magnet, Exodus can take Magneto's spot. He's got a huge ego, makes big speeches, and thinks he's God's gift to mutant kind. Also, we've never seen him in live action before, and you'd know because Exodus has a very unique color scheme. But what are the points against Exodus? My big 2 issues are A, he was the next Magneto, and in a universe without a Magneto, he doesn't make much sense. And B, he is specifically anti-mutate. So if this is a core X-Men story, what's the point of Exodus? Save him for an Avengers or Eternals or Inhumans story. Exodus would shine there. The Shi'ar and Deathbird. The Shi'ar are the alien race most associated with the X-Men. They're a highly advanced society that's also sort of bird-themed. They are usually led by Lilandra, Professor X's long-distance girlfriend. They're from the planet Chandelar and have superhuman strength and intelligence. So that's the Shi'ar, the people. But those people decided to expand their territory, so they created the Shi'ar Empire. The Shi'ar Empire is enormous, spanning more than 1 million worlds, making it the largest empire in Marvel Comics. And their whole deal is marrying people from different species to create alliances and continue to spread the empire. The Shi'ar are ruled by a monarch known as the Magister or Magistrix, the most well-known one being Lilandra. However, like any royal family, the Shi'ar had their share of succession-based drama, and that leads us to the Shi'ar princess, Calci. She was the heir to the Shi'ar space empire until she killed her mom and was cast out. Calci then changed her name to Deathbird, which makes sense because she was born with more avian features than your average Shi'ar, which technically makes her a mutant. Deathbird is incredible. The sort of Rita Repulsa campy villain who does bad guy stuff because she wants to and has fun doing it. You may remember her cameo from X-Men 97 where she called Earth a
Milky Way ghetto.
Amazing. You could totally write a movie about Deathbird taking some Shi'ar loyalists and attacking the X-Men for some reason. Speaking of loyalists, the Shi'ar Magister has their own superhero army called the Imperial Guard. It's not worth explaining what each of them does. All you've got to know is they've got fun little powers and costumes and are led by Kalark, aka Gladiator. He's that guy that, among other things, threw the Juggernaut in the cartoon. And you'd be surprised, since the Shi'ar are a huge part of the Dark Phoenix saga, and Fox won't stop producing watered-down versions of the Dark Phoenix saga, but the Shi'ar have never been in the movies before. Neither in the X-Men movies or the cosmic MCU movies, even though we should run into them by now. So is it time for the Imperial Guard, or God willing Deathbird, to make their move onto the big screen? I'm not convinced. Don't get me wrong, I love them eventually, but again, this feels a little too early. I think the X-Men need to start off dealing with a terrestrial threat. However, I think they should absolutely meet the Shi'ar at some point in the near future, just not yet. Madeline Pryor. Hold on a second. Wasn't the first one of these Strife, and he's just an evil clone of a good guy, and you said he didn't work, so what's so special about Madeline Pryor? I'd say the biggest difference is that while Cable is a well-known X-Man, he's not a household name. Jean Grey is. Hell, we might even see her in a different movie before the proper X-Men movie, so I do think you can count on the audience coming into this movie with a sense for who Jean Grey usually is. But let's back up. Madeline Pryor is a clone of Jean Grey that married a heartbroken Scott after Jean died. Then, Jean came back, Scott abandoned Madeline and their child, Cable, to go be with his old flame, and Madeline got angry. And eventually, she worked with some demons to become the Goblin Queen and create a hell on Earth known as the X-Men crossover event, Inferno. Madeline Pryor has the same telekinesis and telepathy as Jean, as well as the ability to do some magic. She's currently the ruler of the hell-like dimension Limbo, and she's got a thing for Scott Summers, but in a pinch, will settle for his younger brother Alex. So why could Maddie work? Like I said, we know Jean, and this is sort of a fun way to do what people like about the Dark Phoenix saga without space. We still get a Jean who goes bad and fights the X-Men, and Madeline comes with a lot of demons that would play well in big fights. The knocks against this one are pretty simple. While I think we have a sense for Jean, we don't really know much about the character who cloned her, who we will get to, so that's a fair amount of work to do. And second, Madeline worked as a villain because we saw her relationship with Scott deteriorate. It felt earned. So either we would need to start this movie with a title crawl saying that Scott abandoned his Jean replacement, or we'd need to speedrun it in Act 1. Either way, it's rushed. But I think there's a stronger case for Madeline in the movies than people expect. Shadow King. Okay, so this is a weird one. Let's start with Amal Farouk. He was a mutant with telepathic powers who, after his family was killed by a plague, was visited by a thing. The thing was sort of an evil space consciousness made of nightmares calling itself the Shadow King. And because he was lonely, Farouk agreed to be the earthly host of the Shadow King. That meant the psychic monster thing could do evil using Farouk's body, and for most of comics history, the two stayed together. The Shadow King consciousness also has telepathy and might be the strongest telepath in existence. It's able to possess pretty much anyone against their will, and this thing is just plain old evil. Shadow King is known for a few things. In the comics, he was the boss of a group of Egyptian street thieves that included a young Aurora Monroe. Shadow King is also responsible for the Muir Island saga, where he took over a bunch of heroes and forced the X-Men and X-Factor to work together and become a single team. And many people who are not into the comics probably know the Shadow King as the main antagonist of FX's Legion, where he was played mostly by Aubrey Plaza and Naveed Negban, and sometimes he was this weird giant thumb guy. So okay, the Shadow King has shown up in live action, but he's not a household name. It's also on the right scale for a fresh X-Men team. He's got personal connections to Storm. He's a telepath, so that would make him an interesting match for Jean and the Professor. I really only got two negatives with him. First, if you go with the traditional Shadow King route, I can see Farouk being a character with some weird racial connotations. Now obviously, he's a space entity possessing an Egyptian guy, but still could be trouble. Second, and more importantly, while Shadow King is the right villain class for these guys, a fun Shadow King story tends to involve the Shadow King controlling some heroes and forcing them to fight other heroes. So that feels more like a civil war, which you need to set up. We need to know how these guys feel about each other if the turning on one another is going to be interesting. Sentinels. So you are probably familiar with the concept of the Sentinels, an army of usually large mutant hunting robots created by Bolivar Trask and commanded by, at first, the government. They usually can't do the thing they do in Days of Future Past where they copy powers, even though that was cool. We'll get to it. They're more like big purple and magenta cannon fodder, and they take orders from a few characters. The Sentinels are sometimes led by another more formidable Sentinel, and this is something called a Master Mold, and they just look like a big Sentinel who's sitting in a chair. They manufacture normal Sentinels and give them orders sometimes. Then there's Nimrod, a big white sentient Sentinel from the future who hunts mutants even better than the Sentinels and has the ability to adapt and counter mutant powers, sort of like the Days of Future Past Sentinels, which makes sense because that's the comic he's from. Then you've got Bastion, the Sentinel made man who is a fusion of a Master Mold and Nimrod and was responsible for Operation Zero Tolerance, where he turned a bunch of people into Sentinels. This happens in the first season of X-Men 97, with Bastion being played by Theo James. Okay, so I think there's something here. Sentinels are fun. Problem is, it seems like, based on that shot in the Avengers trailer that featured Cyclops, we're gonna get our fill of Sentinels in Doomsday. Still, it's worth perhaps exploring, or at least planting the seeds for Sentinel stuff down the road. Mojo. You may recognize him from one of my pitches. Mojo, the producer tyrant in charge of the Mojoverse, was the antagonist in my Deadpool and Wolverine pitch. He's a pretty weird guy. First, physically, he's part of a race known as the Spineless Ones, and because of his lack of a backbone, Mojo is confined to a robo-scorpion chair, which he is connected to by a bunch of wires. He has yellow or sometimes greenish-yellow skin, and is generally pretty gross. Mojo is a pretty powerful magician. Originally, he was even envisioned as a Doctor Strange villain, but that changed when his creator started working on an X-book that they thought Mojo would fit into. Mojo also has a death touch, which he can use to kill anyone or anything he touches. His chair also has a bunch of weapons, most notably a big scorpion stinger. So that's Mojo. But what does Mojo do? Well, he rules over a planet known as Mojo World, in a dimension called the Mojoverse. And in the Mojoverse, television is king. This is probably because the Mojoverse got hit with radio signals very early in its existence that instilled a respect for television in the Spineless Ones. Mojo rules Mojo World as the ultimate executive. He creates reality shows, usually resembling things like American Gladiators, which he uses to pacify the citizens of Mojo World. Obviously, he's a pretty bad ruler, but he makes damn good TV. Mojo is heavily associated with a couple of X characters. The big ones are Longshot, the luckiest man alive, Dazzler, the disco diva, and Shatterstar, who is described pretty well in the second Deadpool movie as,
"I'm basically better than you at everything."
Shatterstar is both the son of Longshot and Dazzler, and Longshot's father because of time travel. Those three are Mojo's biggest network stars, with Longshot being the most popular by a mile. Mojo's main henchwoman is a six-armed dancing witch called Spiral, although she really hates Mojo because she used to be a regular stunt woman named Ricochet Rita, who Mojo kidnapped, experimented on, and drove crazy. And most of Mojo's schemes involve kidnapping the X-Men and forcing them to compete on his network. He even created a set of clones of the X-Men called the X-Babies, which is pretty good. Mojo stories are usually a commentary on television rotting your brain or reality TV specifically being bad. So is Mojo ready for prime time? We're pretty familiar with the concept of alternate dimensions and universes. We already have a Shatterstar, and Mojo himself is one of the higher profile X-villains who's never been in a live action movie or show. But I think there's a reason for that. You don't necessarily need to build up to Mojo, but you do need your universe to be at a certain place for Mojo to fit in, and the Fox movies were never able to get there. So again, I think it's too early for Mojo. However, I could see him being introduced as the antagonist of a Longshot and Dazzler movie or something like that, and then fighting the rest of the X-Men later. Okay. So now let's look at the characters who I think could work. And I mean, I think one of these guys will almost certainly be a part of the first MCU X-Men movie. These are the layups. And we will start with the Hellfire Club. Since the 17th century, a British secret society has existed that aims to entertain the fantasies of the ultra-wealthy and exert political pressure to gain power. The group was known as the Hellfire Club. Eventually, an American chapter was opened, and for our purposes, that's the one that matters. The Hellfire Club is chess-themed, with the head of the group being the black or white king or queen. Notable black kings include Sebastian Shaw, Shinobi Shaw, Cade Kilgore, and Roberto da Costa. The main queens are Emma Frost, Celine, and a mind-controlled Jean Grey. Everyone under the king and queen are rooks and bishops and so on. That Donald Pierce guy, white bishop. Harry Leland, black bishop. Frederick von Rome, white rook. Marrow, black rook. Callisto, white knight. Sage, you'd figure rook or something, but she was always just an assistant. And I guess that's for the best because she was a spy anyway. Originally, the Hellfire Club was made of wealthy elite humans, but after Shaw began gaining power and the human members of the club grew worried that the mutant members would kill them and take over, the human humans tried to kill Shaw, killed his girlfriend instead, and then Shaw killed all the humans and took over. So you don't need to be a mutant to join. They'll let a cyborg or a werewolf in from time to time, but you might as well be a mutant. Hellfire Club schemes involve money and manipulation, getting rid of a politician they don't like, taking over some sort of valuable international trade route. And also, they have eyes wide shut parties where all the men dress like George Washington and the women dress like underwear models. Speaking of that, the most significant member of the Hellfire Club, by far, is the usually white but sometimes black, and no, I'm not referring to that comic where she stole someone's body, I mean usually white queen but sometimes black queen, Emma Frost. She went on to start her Massachusetts Academy, then it was massacred, so she taught on Genosha, and then after that was massacred, Emma formally joined the X-Men and has been a significant member ever since. She's a powerful telepath who can also turn her body to diamond, although in that form she can't use her telepathy. She was played by January Jones in First Class. It was fine. Other members of note, obviously Sebastian Shaw, who can absorb kinetic energy and use it to enhance his own strength. Harry Leland has the power to manipulate the density of objects and even people. We already covered Celine and Donald Pierce. Sage has a supercomputer for a brain, and then sometimes Jason Wingard, also known as Mastermind, joins the club. He can create illusions like the kid in X2. The Hellfire Club has appeared in 2 X-Men movies. First, they were the antagonists in First Class, and second, they were the bad guys in the Dark Phoenix movie. Yes, I know those were actually aliens, but everything from the costumes to the mansion to the vibe screams rewritten Hellfire Club. Don't believe me? Look at some concept art. I would say the First Class Hellfire Club works, although the club, A, feels very small, it's really just 4 guys, and B, doesn't really know what to do with some of its members, especially Emma Frost. But the outfits, the plans to manipulate the world leaders into starting a nuclear war, that's Hellfire Club. But would they work here? It's certainly possible. I mean, we know they can work in an X-Men reboot because we've seen it. First Class is quite good, and they're in a great spot because you come out of that movie remembering Charles and Magneto and Mystique and Beast and Moira, and Shaw just sort of fades into the background. He plays his part but doesn't draw focus. I think you could prove this if you ask just general sci-fi fans if Kevin Bacon has been in a superhero anything before. I think you'd get the Guardians Christmas special, Toxic Avenger, and maybe even Super before First Class. That's just the theory. And like we saw in First Class, the club is a great match for the X-Men. You get fun one-on-one fights featuring characters with wildly different powers, something even the best of these movies frequently fails at. I've only got a couple negatives. 1, we've done this before. I do not want this to feel like a remake of First Class. 2, the idea of a cabal of wealthy elites who party and also get up to some evil stuff secretly feels a little on the nose these days. And 3, I think our first villain needs to have a very clear message, and let's get rich and have parties doesn't quite measure up to the usual underclass fighting back against the system narrative that a lot of these other guys bring to the table. Still, this could work. Cameron Hodge. I don't want to spend too much time on Cameron Hodge since he was the villain in one of my other X-Men pitches. That one was for a Magneto origin story. And unlike Mojo, he's pretty easy to understand. Hodge is a guy who, because of his friendship with Angel, is able to position himself as an advisor to the X-Men. He's sort of their PR person, but secretly, Hodge hates mutants, specifically Angel, and Hodge is the leader of an anti-mutant hate group known as The Right. Sometimes they have big robots. And yes, eventually he did merge with the techno-organic virus known as the Phalanx and turn into a big scorpion guy, which is awesome, but I think that first arc where he is a villain masquerading as an ally is the most compelling. And he's the kind of figure who would be really useful in an early X-Men story where the X-Men have decided to come out of the shadows but don't have an identity, so they turn to Hodge and he designs the suits and the code names and all that. Honestly, this works for me. Only problem is I don't think Hodge can do this alone. He's one part of a larger story where the big bad is someone more interesting who can pull focus from Hodge to make the mystery work. I could even see a twist where we have a character who is not called Cameron Hodge, but is playing that role, and we don't find out they're a bad guy until the end of Act 2. But who can be the headliner of this movie? Who will put butts in seats? I've got some ideas. The Juggernaut. Kane Marco found a magic gem during the Sencon War that imbued him with the powers of the space demon Cyttorak and transformed him into an unstoppable Juggernaut. Juggernaut is one of the X-Men's oldest and strongest enemies. And sure, Apocalypse or Exodus are really strong, but they do other stuff too. Juggernaut is just raw strength. Kane Marco is a simple man. He robs banks with his good friend Black Tom Cassidy and beats up the X-Men if they try to stop him. He also hates his stepbrother, who happens to be Charles Xavier. But eventually, Juggernaut just became a good guy, because when you get down to it, he's not evil, he's just bad. The Juggernaut has been in both generations of X-Men movies. first played very memely by Vinnie Jones in a big rubber suit, and then later made completely out of CGI and voiced by Ryan Reynolds. I'd say the second incarnation felt closer to comic Kane, although the Vinnie Jones version had its charm. And then Vinnie didn't want to come back for Deadpool and Wolverine, so they got this guy, Aaron W. Reed, who was also jacked Free Guy in Free Guy. So why could Juggernaut be fun? Well, neither The Last Stand or Deadpool 2 spent that much time with Kane, never got into his backstory. Deadpool 2 didn't even show him with the helmet off. So there's room for a fresh narrative. Also, Juggernaut can be a member of a team, perhaps one the X-Men can usually handle, but like Battle Beast and early Invincible, he completely outclasses everyone else. And getting into the relationship between Xavier, his mom, his stepdad, and his jerky stepbrother could be fun. The Against, I don't know, he's not necessarily a mastermind villain who comes up with a plan to do something dramatic to humankind or whatever, he's just a guy. So I think, while Juggernaut could be an amazing position player, he needs someone giving him orders. Arcade. One of a few human villains on this list, Arcade is just a weird guy who builds death traps and uses them to kill the X-Men. But unlike, say, Apocalypse, Arcade is not doing this because he wants to strengthen evolution by weeding out the weak or something like that. He just loves to make big death traps. What usually happens is Arcade is hired to kill someone, and Arcade kidnaps that person and drops them into one of his incredibly complex death traps known as Murder Worlds. And while he can kill a human, Arcade has a lot of trouble with heroes. But again, he doesn't even care if he kills his targets, he's just in it for the love of the game. I really think that Arcade is the X-villain with the most potential. Not because he's the most interesting, but because he's such a loser. Think the Batman villain Kite Man. And like Kite Man, one good writer can take Arcade from a joke to a serious threat. He's Jigsaw meets the Joker, Toy Man meets Squid Game. There's something here. The problem with Arcade is I don't think he's the kind of villain who we want for a core X-Men movie. It would be like making Ghost the villain of an Avengers movie. That's just not what Arcade is for. I think there is a place for him though, perhaps in a New Mutants or Academy X movie. Hell, in the comics, he pretty much just did Battle Royale with the Avengers Academy kids. So why not that, but with Generation X or something? That could totally work. Mystique. Getting to the big dogs now. You know Mystique. She's been the main character in way more X-Men movies than even Cyclops. And she's got an iconic look and power set. Blue skin, red hair, and that little skull thing. Still not sure what it's for. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. But not only does she serve an incredibly useful purpose as the bad guy's spy, she has also led the Brotherhood of Mutants. She even worked with the government to turn the Brotherhood into a mutant SEAL Team 6 known as the Freedom Force. So say we don't want to start with Magneto, since he's been done so many times before. We can take a Magneto type of story and give it to Mystique. She's smart, capable, and has a lot of interesting relationships. She's married to a precog named Destiny, she is Nightcrawler's biological mother, and she's Rogue's adopted mother who trained her to be a villain. And here's where I can see a storyline taking shape. The Brotherhood, featuring Rogue, kill a bunch of high-profile anti-mutant leaders or whatever, and when the X-Men show up to stop them, Rogue beats them all, but then over the course of the movie she realizes she's one of the bad guys and switches sides. Sort of like the twins in Age of Ultron. This would be a great way to cast a team of X-Men that isn't too unwieldy, maybe just 5, but by adopting Rogue, we get to grow the team by the end of the story. It plays. Nox against Mystique, the big one, she's just overexposed. Maybe even more so than Magneto. Because at least with Magneto, it's like he's their arch enemy, what are you gonna do? But Mystique is realistically a B-lister who got more screen time than almost any of the Generation 2 X-Men. And we know Mystique is one of the characters who will come back for Doomsday, so audiences might want a break. But let's talk about the big man. Magneto. I don't need to explain Magneto to you. Everyone knows who Magneto is. And therein lies our first problem. Magneto has made appearances in every core X-Men movie. He was the bad guy in 3 of them, was kind of the bad guy in 3 more, and our 2 Magnetos, Ian McKellen and Michael Fassbender, each brought so much to this already rich character. So many moments like Magneto levitating the Golden Gate Bridge or the baseball stadium, prison escape, the fight on the train, holding up all the cops, the chess games, the memes, this line. All the old friends, the crying, this line.
I've been at the mercy of men just following orders. Never again.
But okay, in case you've never heard of Magneto before now, which it's great that you survived that 60-year coma. But anyway, Eric Lenscher is a Holocaust survivor with the mutant ability to control metal and uses that gift to make sure humanity never does to mutants what it did to the Jews. Simple. He created the Brotherhood of Mutants and he's Wanda and Pietro's father when it's convenient. And I think this is the instinct of anyone thinking about the first X-Men movie to default to Magneto opposing the team. I get that. He was the villain in their first comic. But I think there's a much stronger case to be made for waiting until movie 2. Like in our first movie, these X-Men are fighting some other villain, and maybe Xavier even thinks Magneto's dead, but the events of the movie force Magneto to act in the next movie. Maybe now people know mutants exist and are hostile, or the government is building weapons to fight the mutants, and that really pisses Magneto off. You could also, and I think this would be a weird place to start, but still, you could have Magneto be a good guy. Either like First Class, this is before the schism within the team, or Xavier's dead or missing and Magneto reforms and takes his place. It does happen in the comics, there's precedent. But the same way I think people want a classic Doctor Doom or Galactus, I think Magneto should at least start in his traditional role. Third option, Magneto is a chaotic third party. This is sort of how God Loves Man Kills plays out. The X-Men are fighting the Purifiers and then Magneto intervenes to save the team. I don't hate this one. But either way, I don't think Magneto should be the big bad of the first movie. Reverend Stryker. Reverend William Stryker is a simple character. He's a Christian minister who hates mutants and becomes incredibly popular as the representative of the mutant-hating public. Why does Stryker hate mutants? Well, when Stryker's wife gave birth to a mutant, Stryker killed the child and then his wife. And to be fair to William Stryker, at the time, he didn't know what a mutant was, so he thought the kid was the Antichrist or something. While Stryker was growing his congregation, he was also recruiting a small army of mutant-hating killers known as the Purifiers. And Stryker tried to use Xavier to kill all the mutants, but was stopped by Magneto and the X-Men. It was great. 10 out of 10, no notes. He does come back every so often as a cyborg or satanic sorcerer, but he peaked in his debut, and traditionally he has no powers besides charisma. He's been in more movies than you probably remember. In X2, Stryker was played by Brian Cox, who you may recognize from Succession. Then he showed up in Origins Wolverine, played by Danny Huston, who you would also recognize from Succession. And then he's in Days of Future Past and Apocalypse, played by Josh Hellman, who, fun fact, was not in Succession, but was originally hired in Days of Future Past to play the Juggernaut, but that character was written out of the movie and replaced with Quicksilver. But those Strykers were all very different from comic Stryker. Sure, comic Stryker was in the military before he became a reverend, which explains why he's able to lead a militia, but plenty of X-villains have led militias. The religious stuff is Stryker's main thing. So I think that gives us an interesting lane to play in. A comic faithful take on Stryker would feel completely fresh. Play the military connections down, just have Stryker be a popular minister whose wife and child were killed by a mutant, or so it would seem. I don't even think the Purifiers need to work for him. They could just as easily come up naturally as a result of Stryker's bigoted sermons. I think that might be more compelling. And this Stryker could feel different from the comics if the take on the character is contemporary, like maybe he's an online minister or even a full-on faith influencer. I'm sure those exist. He could have a podcast. He could be pals with the administration. And the best part is, Stryker does not need to be the only villain. It works really well if he gets a bigger platform because of a different mutant, like Magneto, or if Stryker is being used by another villain to turn public sentiment on mutants for whatever reason. Mr. Sinister. That leaves us with Nathaniel Essex, aka Mr. Sinister. Here's a fun fact about Sinister. The X-Men are sort of named after him. I know, you're saying, wait, what about the character literally named Charles Xavier who created and leads the team? Surely they're named after him, they're Xavier's men. You would think so, but, and I was as surprised about this as you are, that was never the deal. Not even really early in their history. Before Magneto was a Holocaust survivor, before Beast was blue, the X in the name X-Men refers to them having extra power. It's in the first issue, I don't know what to tell you. But that explanation has changed over the years, and it is now understood that the X-Men are named after the fact that their mutant abilities come from something called the X gene or the X factor. So what does that have to do with Sinister? Well, Nathaniel Essex was a scientist in London around the 1800s who discovered something, a genetic mutation, and specifically a genetic potential that people called the Essex factor. But Essex would go on to be cast out of the scientific community, and the name of that mutation was eventually shortened to just X factor. So if the X-Men are named after the X gene, they're named that because of Mr. Sinister. The more you know. So like I said, Nathaniel Essex, not a mutant, just a guy, a scientist who believed it was possible for evolution to jump forward in extreme situations. Essex was right, of course, and mutants did exist, but it was difficult at the time to prove. So Essex did more and more unethical experiments to prove his thesis, and when he was eventually found out, he was ostracized by the other scientists and his family, leaving him with nothing but his research. So Essex continued his experimentation, now by just kidnapping subjects off the street, and Essex eventually ran into Apocalypse. And after Essex's wife frees all the people Essex was experimenting on, she curses him and specifically uses the word Sinister. Then she dies. So Essex, now calling himself Mr. Sinister, returns to Apocalypse, and Apocalypse uses the celestial technology he found to augment Essex, turning him into a mutate with the ability to control his molecules similarly to Apocalypse, so he can heal, transform, give himself super strength, durability, all kinds of stuff. As you can see, Sinister has an interesting whole deal. Chalk white skin, black hair, red eyes, sometimes pointy teeth, a red diamond on his forehead, and he wears a blue costume with a luxurious cape. And that is fun thing about Sinister number 1. He gets it. He wasn't just born with a bad guy name by coincidence, he picked it. He doesn't need to wear the cape, he knows it's iconic. Different versions of Sinister play in different ways. Sometimes he's basically just a vampire, but I think the most interesting Sinister is campy. He's having a good time, sort of like Loki or Hamill's Joker. Another fun thing about Sinister, he's really into cloning. He makes clones of himself, clones of his friends, enemies. He makes sure those clones don't know that they're clones, so he lends himself well to big team fights because there can be a ton of him. Sort of like if Ultron was a copy of one guy. Another fun thing about Sinister, he is obsessed with the Summers Gray family. This is probably because Scott and Jean traveled back in time to Sinister's origin, and also just because Jean specifically is such a powerful mutant, Sinister correctly believes her child will be an even more powerful mutant, and Sinister wants his own even more powerful mutant so he can kill Apocalypse. So assuming this core X-Men movie features the 2 core X-Men, Jean and Cyclops, Sinister is a villain who brings some interesting personal stakes. And it doesn't need to be that they time traveled to his origin either, but just something about Jean and Scott gets his attention. And another great thing about Sinister, he's never been in one of these movies before. Yes, the name Essex has shown up 4 times in the X-Men movies. First, in the Apocalypse post-credits scene, someone from the Essex Corp collects Logan's blood. Then in Logan, we see the Essex Corp use that blood to make Laura. Then in Deadpool 2, we see that Essex also owns a line of abusive orphanages. And then finally in New Mutants, it seemed like Dr. Cecilia Reyes was working for and even communicating over text with Mr. Sinister. There were even rumors that John Hamm was going to show up in a New Mutants post-credits scene or something as Sinister. This obviously never happened, but still, we've been close. But unlike Apocalypse, Sinister has not been tainted with a poorly received live-action portrayal. In fact, they test drove Sinister once and it totally worked. The version of Sebastian Shaw from First Class shares way more with comic Sinister than comic Shaw. He's obsessed with evolution. He dresses like Sinister tends to dress. He's got the flair of Sinister, and his origin, scientists experimenting on mutants and specifically young Magneto during the Holocaust, is a Mr. Sinister thing. Also, Shaw's not the type to just recruit people to work with him even if they're mutants. They need to be worthy of joining his Hellfire Club. But Sinister would absolutely make Angel Salvatore one of his marauders if it was useful. So we know that Sinister works as a core X-Men origin movie villain. Also, Sinister is iconic. The same way I expect most people can just recognize Magneto based on the powers and costume, I think Sinister could get there with the right exposure. I'm willing to bet that because I had all these toys as a child and as an adult, but because my mom saw all of them and heard their names, even though she hasn't seen them in a while, I bet she could pick Sinister out of a lineup quicker than anyone else who's never been in a movie before, like Fabian Cortez or Trevor Fitzroy. 2 characters that did not come up in this video at all because I don't really have strong feelings about them, but they're fine. So yeah, I know it's an easy answer, and I love being contrarian as much as the next guy, but it's hard to argue that any villain is better positioned than Mr. Sinister to play the antagonist in our first MCU core X-Men movie, with someone like Stryker or Hodge acting as a secondary antagonist. Let me know in the comments or on social media what you think of my picks, or just who you thought I missed altogether. Maybe later this year we'll make the Who Should Be on the Team video, and even a pitch, so keep your eye on this channel. Now, as far as casting for Mr. Sinister, a lot of people have different actors they'd like to see. In the thumbnail for this video, I suggest Wagner Moura. I think he's at the right spot in his career, and I think he's got the charisma that would make Sinister fun. The one name that comes up whenever people talk about Mr. Sinister casting is Tom Ellis, who, don't get me wrong, I like. And I imagine most people like him because he played the titular Lucifer on the TV series based on the comic book Lucifer. Then Mr. Sinister, while he's not the devil, I mean, clearly, Marvel Comics has plenty of devils. Like, not only do they have characters like Searcher and Hela, they have Mephisto, who's very close to what you would expect from the devil. Then they also have now the one below all, who seems to supersede Mephisto. There's also different Lords of Hell. Strong Guy, one of my favorite X-Men, ended up being a Lord of Hell for a while. All I'm saying is Mr. Sinister has a lot of the same qualities that Tom Ellis was able to bring to Lucifer. And Mr. Sinister is one of those characters that's not complicated. Like, he may have complicated plans and schemes, but he is a bad guy through and through. You're not supposed to empathize with him. He is just supposed to be a bad guy. So I understand why people would think an actor known for playing the devil would be a good Mr. Sinister. And it's interesting because so much of what defines the devil as a pop culture figure are things that we just made up along the way that have nothing to do with the Bible. It was something I learned while I was watching a video by the channel Curious Archive as part of their Gods and Monsters series about the modern devil. It talks about the differences between big evil Diablo devil and the slick, manipulating, and maybe a little bit sexy Lucifer devil. It talks about where those versions of this, for lack of a better word, character came from. It's really interesting. And if you want to watch that video, along with all of my videos, early and ad-free, you should definitely check out this video's sponsor, Nebula. Nebula is a subscription streaming platform that I and a bunch of other YouTubers you probably already love helped to create. First thing that's important, all of our videos go up there early and ad-free. So if you want to be the first person to see one of my Nando V movies or Nando cut videos, Nebula is for you. This video was on Nebula months ago. And then there are series like Jetlag or Tom Scott's England, where they go up on Nebula a week before they go anywhere else. Then we also have Nebula exclusive series of videos, like Tom Nicholas has a series called Slow News Day. Captain Midnight has a series called Showrunners, where he looks at different people that have created television shows. The first episode is about Rod Serling in The Twilight Zone. The second episode is about Vince Gilligan in Breaking Bad. Looks at the journey of how they got to where they were and how that shaped the series they would showrun. And then Curious Archive's Gods and Monsters series looks at these different legendary creatures from religion and mythology and talks about how the ideas of those creatures has evolved over time and they've turned into pop culture characters. So you can find all that great stuff exclusively on Nebula. And a year of Nebula is already a steal at $60 a year. That is $5 a month. But if you go to go.nebula.tv/NandoVMovies, you can get Nebula for just $2.50 a month. That is $30 for the year. It's an awesome deal. Go check it out. I guarantee there is a creator you already love who's part of Nebula. And if you spend some time on Nebula, I bet you'll find your new favorite creator. After me, of course. Your second favorite creator because I'm your favorite. Don't correct me. Again, that is go.nebula.tv/NandoVMovies. Besides that, thank you to everybody who continues to support the channel on Patreon, everybody that watches these videos early and ad-free on Nebula, everybody that listens to my podcast, mostly Nitpicking, everybody that follows me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all that stuff. I'm Nando V Movies on all of those platforms except TikTok, where I'm at Nando Kelly because A, it's complicated. Anyway, that's all I got. I'll see you next time. Bye.